Today on Questions Answered, we're answering questions about single speed and fixed gear. They're really similar, but they're different in one really important way. So the first question is, what's the difference between single speed and fixed gear? And the answer is that fixed gear bikes and single speed bikes are both single speed. But if we're talking about single speed as a category versus fixed gear as a category, the one significant difference that is so meaningful is the ability to coast. And single speed bikes have the ability to coast. And that's due to a disengagement mechanism or a freewheel or free hub in the rear hub that disengages the drivetrain from the wheel and allows riders to pedal forward, but then stop pedaling and continue to move forward. Now, if we compare that single speed bike to a fixed gear bike, the most significant difference is that when the pedals stop moving, the rear wheel stops moving. They are totally locked together. There's no disengagement mechanism on this bike. The crankset and the rear wheel are locked together in one. It's as if the pedals are mounted right on the wheel. If you think about a penny farthing, that old school style of bike, where the pedals are connected to the front wheel, it's just like that, except that it uses gearing to multiply at the rider's inputs. So if the wheel is moving, the pedals are moving. If the pedals are moving, the wheel is moving. They are completely connected. This is the simplest kind of wheel for a bike. It's a fixed hub, which means the cog threads on directly to the hub. And there's no disengagement mechanism, which means once it's threaded on, it is locked in place. And you use a lock ring here to ensure that it doesn't unthread while you ride. Because when you're riding a fixed bike, there's forces moving the cog forward and moving the cog back when you resist the forward motion of the wheel or skid. There's a few different kinds of single speed hubs, but this one uses a cassette body, which means that there's a system here to disengage this whole free spinning body that's part of the wheel itself. So in this case, the cog slides in place, the lock ring that threads on and keeps the cog from coming off of the free hub. The wheel and the cog spin forwards, but the cog can spin backwards or stay in place while the wheel is spinning. So the difference in riding experience between a single speed and a fixed gear bike comes down to that ability to coast. And that ability to coast is built into the rear hub. So single speed bikes have a disengagement mechanism in the hub or in the freewheel of the cog itself, but there's a disengagement mechanism in the rear wheel that allows you to pedal forwards and engage the cog in the hub and stop pedaling and still keep moving forwards. Whereas on a fixed gear bike, you are constantly engaged because the hub is threaded and locked in place onto that hub and can't move backwards or forwards. So that means if the wheel is moving and the hub is moving, then the cranks and the pedals are also moving. So the next question is, why would somebody choose to ride single speed and why would somebody choose to ride fixed gear? And I think the reason why people gravitate towards either one of these bikes in general is because they're so simple. They're a really simple riding experience. They're as low maintenance as it gets for bikes because once you remove the gears from the equation, there's one less thing that can go wrong and one less thing to maintain. So why would a rider choose to ride a fixed gear bike? Well, one reason could be racing, specifically velodrome or track racing, which is one of the oldest forms of bike racing. So one of the reasons that people ride fixed gear bikes in velodrome racing is tradition. Being one of the oldest forms of racing, people used really, really simple bikes when track racing started. And the simplest kind of bike is a fixed gear. But there's also some safety and performance reasons why people need to run a fixed gear bike in a velodrome. And one of them is that brakes aren't allowed. But riding a fixed gear bike, it gives you a ton of control and a ton of subtle control over your speed. So when you're riding in a tight group, going top speed, and you need to make a minute change to how fast you're going, being locked into the pedals and to the speed of the rear wheel is the best way to make a subtle change and keep pace with all the other riders. But a lot of riders choose to ride fixed gear bikes outside of the velodrome on city streets, around neighborhoods, and all over the place. So why would that be? Well, it comes down to that same feeling that you get on the velodrome of being fully connected to the bike, and that level of control that you get from being locked in and connected to the rear wheel. You don't get a more visceral and connected riding experience than you get on a fixed gear bike because of that connection to the rear wheel. So being able to make subtle changes to your speed or entering this sort of flow between you, the bike, and your surroundings, there's really no better way to do that than on a fixed gear bike. So it comes down to personal preference. Some riders choose it because they like how it feels. So what are the pros and cons of single speed? Well, in general, riding a single speed bike is much simpler. So it's a simple and easy riding experience, but still allows you to coast, which is good for most people. And that's because when you can coast, you can spin a faster cadence than you can maintain to get up to speed, and then stop pedaling and continue to move, which can be super helpful on hills or long straightaways, or just if you don't want to be pedaling all the time. And most people don't want to be pedaling all the time. So riding a single speed bike gives you that simplicity, that easy riding experience, but allows you the ability to coast and freewheel. Most people are used to the ability to coast, and that's just what people think of when they think of a bike these days. So the actual, the weird thing would be hopping on a bike with a fixed hub and being surprised in not being able to coast. But there are some downsides, I guess, in comparison. One con of single speed versus fixed gear is that you need to have brakes on your bike. Now, that's probably not a con for most people, but if you're trying to have the most simple bike possible, it is an added complication. Having a freewheel on your bike or a free hub or disengagement mechanism in the rear wheel is some additional complexity as well over a fixed gear bike that will require service at some point. So a single speed bike is slightly more complicated and requires slightly more maintenance in the long run compared to a fixed gear bike. Single speed bikes in general, a pro over multi-speed bikes is that simplicity and that low maintenance aspect. But a con is that if you only have one gear, then you're either going to be working much harder uphill, spinning out on the downhills, or some combination of both compared to having a multi-speed bike where you can change gear to pedal more easily uphill and downhill and find that right pedaling speed and pedaling effort for a given gradient or scenario. So what are the pros and cons of fixed gear? Well, one pro is simplicity. It is the simplest kind of bike you can possibly have. And another pro is that it's slightly lighter than a single speed bike. If you get rid of that disengagement mechanism in the hub, maybe you get rid of your brakes if you're not riding on the road. So that's a slight weight savings advantage. Then there's also the riding experience advantage, and that comes down to personal preference, but it's a more connected way to ride your bike, literally. Some people might compare it to driving a manual versus driving an automatic in the car. You're much more synced in to the driving or riding experience. Okay, so what are the cons of riding fixed gear? Well, you can't coast, so that makes normal riding a bit more challenging. People who are really good at riding fixed can coast in a sense where they let their legs kind of spin loosely, but you can really only do that so fast, even the best riders. So there's a slight performance disadvantage, particularly if you're going downhill. And then there's the other general cons compared to a multi-speed bike where not being able to shift means that you're going to work harder in most conditions compared to a multi-speed bike. Can any bike be made single speed or fixed gear? The answer is, for the most part, yes. You can take most multi-speed bikes and convert them to single speed with some modifications, but it may not be worth it because single speed bikes that were designed from the ground up to be single speed generally will have a bit of weight savings and some chain or belt tensioning features built into the frame to make it simpler and easier to set them up single speed. Similarly with fixed gear bikes, you need to have a bike that's designed to have a system to tension the chain or the belt. And with single speed bikes, you can do that without a built-in mechanism to tension the chain or belt. But a fixed gear bike, there needs to be tension on the top and the bottom of the chain or belt. So usually the rear wheel needs to slide back and forth in the dropouts in order to properly tension the drivetrain. Is there an advantage to having a belt drive, single speed, or fixed gear bike? And my answer is definitely. And that is because all the things that make a single speed bike low maintenance are even better with a belt drive system, because you don't have to lubricate the belt, it doesn't rust, and it lasts longer than a chain. So it's just an even simpler ownership experience. But there's also a smoothness advantage, and I think this is particularly nice when you're riding a fixed gear belt drive bike, in that there's no chain slack. If you're somebody who's used to riding fixed gear, you're familiar with some slack in the chain, where if you pedal forwards, there's a little bit of a gap as the chain takes up its slack. But with a belt drive fixed gear bike, there's no slack. So there's no delay when you start to put the power down. It feels super smooth and connected. In fact, I think it's the best way to experience a fixed gear setup. If you have any more questions about single speed, fixed gear, or anything else bike related, post it in the comments and we'll address it in a future video. Thanks for watching.